Amen. Amen. Well, our Bible reading this evening comes from Philippians chapter 1. And we're going to read from chapter 1, verse 1, all the way through to verse 18. But Andrew will be focusing on 12 to 18 as he brings the word to us later. But we'll read from verse 1. Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are at Philippi, with the overseers and deacons. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you all, making my prayer with joy, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. It is right for me to feel this way about you all, because I hold you in my heart. For you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. For God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus. And it is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent, and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some, indeed, preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. But what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Amen. Amen. Well, we sing.
I encourage you to have Philippians 1 there open before you, verses 12 to 18. The gospel is announced in Genesis 3 as soon as sin has entered the garden, more or less. The son of the woman will wage war on the serpent and ultimately crush it. The fulfillment of that gospel promise is finally seen in the last chapters of Revelation, the garden city where sin is banished and God reigns in righteousness and his people bask in his glory. And in between, the story unfolds through great paradox. On the one hand, there is a sense of the sheer relentlessness of God's unfolding purpose. He has set a course for history, for his glory and for our good, and he will see it through. He has made gospel promises, and he will keep them. He will have his way, and nothing will stop him. That's what Nebuchadnezzar is forced to recognize. If you remember that great statement in Daniel 4, this pagan king who says, your God, Daniel, this Lord, he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? So you have this sense of the relentlessness of God's work in time and eternity. But the paradox is that the line from Genesis 3 to Revelation 22 is not a straight one, is it? In fact, that's the understatement of the century. It is a meandering line and takes all kinds of strange twists and turns. The unfolding of God's purposes is relentless, and yet it is often perplexing. From start to finish, there is just a strangeness and a surprisingness and an unexpectedness to the way that God works. He uses means that we would never have chosen, timescales that we would never have set, people that we would never have relied on. He works through events that appear awful to us, actions of men that are appallingly sinful, and times when his purposes are just shrouded in utter impenetrable blackness. And yet somehow in the mysterious wisdom of God, out of the end of all of that comes a glorious and perfect plan of salvation, moving constantly towards an end which he has known from the beginning. There is a strange relentlessness to God's ways. And what we see on a grand scale throughout the Bible, Genesis 3 to Revelation 22, we see in snapshot form here in Philippians 1. The strange relentlessness of the work of God is put on display in the life of Paul as gospel advance comes about through great suffering. And so just two things this evening. You'll see them on the sheet there. We see God advancing the gospel through the weakness of his servants, and we see him advancing the gospel despite the worldliness of his servants. So God advances the gospel through the weakness of his servants. What is it that Paul says has advanced the gospel? Well, it's what he describes in verse 12 as what has happened to me. I want you to know that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. And that really is a kind of a, no, really it has. It's a sort of surprising really. So what has happened to him? Well, let's just quickly recap that. At the end of Paul's missionary journeys, 3 of them we have recorded, he said something strange in Acts 20. He said, "Now behold, I am going to Jerusalem, constrained by the Spirit, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and affliction await me." But off he goes. And true enough, there in Jerusalem, false accusations are used to stir up a lynch mob against him. He is seized, he is badly beaten, and has people just screaming for his death. Roman soldiers kindly interrupt this beating, only to arrest him. He narrowly escaped a flogging and then a murder plot before being transferred to a Roman prison in Caesarea, where he is left to languish for over 2 years. It's one of those great little lines in Acts that you can just skip past, but 2 years of Paul just sitting in prison. And we know nothing else about that time. Vicious and false accusations against Paul continued during that time, along with various court appearances, and in the background, another plot to kill him. Eventually, he's taken from Caesarea to Rome by way of an arduous, dangerous sea voyage. They're all threatened by starvation for a good while, until eventually they're shipwrecked. Paul survives a further plan by some of the soldiers just to kill all of the prisoners on board, and then survives being bitten by a venomous snake. And so we came to Rome, says Luke, finally, in Acts 28. There, Paul was given the privilege of paying for his own prison. He was allowed to rent a house at his own expense, where he was kept under house arrest, chained to a Roman guard, 24 hours a day, for at least a further 2 years. The wheels of Roman justice ground slowly. All of that litany of rejection and pain and injustice and mortal peril is what has happened to me. So you have to imagine the Christians there in Philippi looking to the founder of their church, this man that they love dearly. You can sense the relationship throughout this letter. And every now and then, word comes to them, a report comes to them of what's happening in the life of Paul. They would have had scattered reports from time to time. They would have been praying for him. And if they're anything like us, what would they have been praying? They would have been praying, "Lord, immediately release Paul. Please." And then a letter comes. "Now I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Imagine suddenly hearing that. Paul just shifts their whole focus. This isn't about how I'm doing. This isn't about how you or I would have chosen to advance the gospel. This is about how God has decided to do his work. And of course, throughout the Bible, God does most of his work not through the strengths and the triumphs of impressive people, but through the weakness and defeat of unimpressive people. That was the lesson, if you remember, that the Corinthians were so slow to learn. God chooses what is foolish and weak and low and despised to shame everything that is humanly impressive and to make clear this is my work, not yours. And so my heading for this part of the sermon is very deliberate. God advances the gospel not despite the weakness of his servants. That wouldn't be an accurate statement. That wouldn't be quite right. God advances the gospel through the weakness of his servants. This is how he has decided it will be. And so Paul sees that God has a purpose for him in chains in Rome. I think it's quite significant. I can't remember if I said this before, but I think it's quite significant that this is where Luke ends the book of Acts. The book of Acts is bracketed. It begins with Jesus commissioning his disciples to take the gospel to the end of the earth. And so the story of the gospel unfolds, and much of it is attached to Paul to the point that at points you're almost tempted to think this is a kind of biography of Paul, and we're going to follow through Paul's story. And then suddenly, do you remember Acts stops and Paul's in prison, and we're not told the end. We have to rely on early church tradition to know what happened to Paul. But Acts stops. Why does it stop where it stops? Well, because it's not actually about Paul at all. It's about the gospel. And it stops where it stops because at that point, the gospel has reached Rome and is being freely and boldly proclaimed at the heart of the world. There's a significance to where Luke begins with the commissioning and where he ends with the gospel in Rome. And you're seeing in that this strange relentlessness of God's work. Paul sees that. So if you glance forward to verse 16, he refers in passing, it's just a kind of in by-the-by comment, he refers to people who know that he has been put here for the defense of the gospel. It's an interesting expression, isn't it? Put here. Put here by whom? In order to defend the gospel. Well, it's a word that's more significant than it sounds. If you remember back to the temple, Luke 2, Simeon cradling the infant Jesus, and he tells Mary, this child is appointed for the fall and rising of many. Or if we jumped forward to 1 Thessalonians 3, Paul speaks about how believers are destined to endure suffering. Those are uses of the same word. Appointed, destined, put there. Paul's saying, I have been appointed to this place. I have been destined by God to be here now for the defense of the gospel. He has stationed me here. It's a semi-military text. It's almost got a kind of military tone to it. He has stationed me here. Alec Matier, Bible scholar, puts it like this. Paul did not see his suffering as an act of divine forgetfulness. Why did God let this happen to me? Nor as a dismissal from service. I was looking forward to years of usefulness, and now look at me. Nor as the work of Satan. I'm afraid the devil has had his way this time. But as the place of duty, the setting for service, the task appointed. A while ago, someone gave me, very kindly gave me, the autobiography of Captain Tom. Remember Captain Tom, who so inspired the nation last year, Captain Tom Moore, before he died in February at the age of 100. And at one point in the story of his life, he mentions a particular posting he received in military service, which disappointed him. I can't remember what the details were, but he didn't want to go to this place, and I think he was probably thinking he would be posted somewhere exotic, and he actually got sent to Walthamstow somewhere, I don't know. And this is what he said: if there was one thing I'd learned It was that from the moment I put on my uniform, my life was in the hands of others, and that was that. My orders were to be obeyed. From the moment I put on my uniform, my life was in the hands of others. That's Paul, isn't it? Should be all of us. But Paul's got the uniform on. My life is in the hands of my commanding officer, and he has stationed me here. This is where he wants me. And if this is where he wants me, then this is where I'll be. And although it can often be hard to discern the purpose of God in the midst of difficult events, already by the point he writes Philippians, Paul can see two striking ways in which his imprisonment has served to advance the gospel. It's done that, firstly, through his witness to the world. Look at verse 13. And through all of this, he says, it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. The imperial guard, the praetorium, was the Roman emperor's personal specialist division of elite troops. Kind of like the commandos or something. There were 9,000 of them stationed there in Rome. How could such a group of proud, self-sufficient pagans ever hear the gospel? Well, do you remember a few weeks ago how God broke Paul out of prison in Philippi so he could do God's work? Well, now God has broken Paul into prison in Rome so he can do his work there. And over time, it became obvious to the soldiers working there that this man is no dangerous criminal. This man is no threat to anyone. This man has been locked up because of someone called Jesus. And suddenly you find that all the talk in the canteen is about Paul and about Jesus. The guys around the water cooler are kind of, what is this? Who is this Jesus? Who's he supposed to be? What did he do? And remember that Paul was chained to a Roman soldier at all times. You've got to think about that for a while, because we know that he received guests. He was free to receive guests. And so he had people coming in, and he was explaining the gospel to them. He was opening up the scriptures to them, showing how all the way through the Old Testament, all of this was leading up to Christ. He was testifying to what had happened, the events of the gospel, going through it all. He was pleading with people to trust in Jesus. And the whole time, there are Roman soldiers. Literally, he has literally a captive audience. They think he's captive, but is it conceivable that Paul wasn't also directly, personally witnessing to them in the course of 2 years? In my mind's eye, I imagine the change of shift, and a guard comes in and unlocks the previous guard and gives him the key, and he gets chained in next to Paul and sits down, and Paul looks at them and says, Quintus, remind me, where did we get to last time? So the news goes out that Paul is suffering for a particular message about a particular person. He hasn't gained anything. He hasn't taken anything from anyone. He hasn't served himself in any way. He is suffering for this Jesus. This is the talk of the praetorium, the imperial guard, and it seems to be the talk of the town as well. It has become known to all the rest, he says. His suffering has become a witness to the world. And then there's a second way that the gospel has been advanced by Paul's suffering, which is that it's also become a challenge to the church. Something counterintuitive has happened in Rome. Look at verse 14. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. That's an interesting expression, isn't it? They've become confident in the Lord because of Paul's imprisonment. In the Roman mind, this kind of treatment is meant to have a deterrent effect on these pesky religious types. Look what's going to happen to you if you don't keep quiet about this new religion of yours. But somehow in God's providence, it's done the opposite. The sight of a man genuinely willing to suffer and die for Christ has challenged and moved and inspired Christians throughout Rome. The implication is maybe that they haven't been as bold as they might have been up to now, and that speaking the word into hostile Roman culture was something that they maybe understandably feared to do, but now they're much more bold, says Paul. So you could, at one level, look at the situation and say, isn't it terrible that Paul can't go on a preaching tour around all the churches in Rome? But all that Paul is thinking is, the gospel that I'm here to serve is touring all the churches in Rome. It's going out there. He's learning here in a very, very concrete way the lesson that he would later pass on to Timothy in a later period of imprisonment, that while Paul might be in chains, the word of God is not bound. So he writes all of this to Philippi. Why does he write what he writes, verses 12 to 14? Well, part of what he's doing, I think, is that he's assuring the Philippians who love him dearly that he's okay. I'm in God's hands and I'm fine. Part of it is that he's teaching them to renew their thinking, to go beyond that surface view of things, to look at what God is doing in his life. And then I think we have reason to believe that a further part of what he's doing is trying to help them in the challenges that they face, because I mentioned over the last few weeks, we have reason to believe there are references scattered throughout this letter to opposition that they're encountering and hardship that they're having to bear. Paul mentions, if you glance forward to verse 30, that the Philippians themselves are engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had. You saw it yourselves when I was arrested in Philippi, and that you now hear I still have. But you're engaged in it too. And so he's saying to them, yes, it's hard. Things are happening to me. Things have happened to me. But God rules over it all, and God brings good out of it all. God serves the gospel through it all. And with a strange relentlessness, he makes his word and his message advance. It is a great thing to know, isn't it? I'm thinking a little bit about that this morning. Through some of the parables of Jesus. But a great thing to know in our cultural context right now, where, well, let's be honest, the strangeness of God's ways is much more obvious to us than the relentlessness of them. It's exactly what we were looking at this morning. The work of the gospel often looks unimpressive in our culture today. It doesn't feel like relentless triumph, does it? We're in these twists and turns of the road along the way. And it's hard to see sometimes what God is doing. On the surface, we see the decline of the church. We see the sidelining of Christian truth. We see the watering down of the mainstream churches who have long been fearful to speak the word. We see the soft censorship of cancel culture. We see the unacceptability of biblical truth and ethics in the public square. And all of that to the point that the aggressively secular can gloat that religion is clearly, finally on the way out. The servants of God have been chained. Their voice has been stifled. We've shown these Christians what will happen if they keep on saying things that are unacceptable and believing things that are offensive. The laws are being drafted as we speak. Well, through it all, we can take great courage, great encouragement, great help, actually, from what Paul does. And from, if I can put it this way, let's look at how Paul uses his ears, his eyes, and his mouth. With his ears, he hears the word of God and knows that God will accomplish his gospel purposes. God is working his purpose out. With his eyes, he therefore sees his own circumstances not as man does, but as God does. You look at it horizontally and things look bleak, but from a God's eye point of view, the gospel is advancing. And so with his mouth, well, Paul just goes on declaring the gospel wherever God has placed him. He's been commissioned to do a work, and he'll keep on doing it until the Lord calls him home. And so, if we feel weak and unsure of ourselves and not well placed and under fire, then we can take heart, because God advances the gospel through the weakness of his servants. And then at verses 15 to 18, we find another strange aspect of the relentlessness of God. There's more surprise for us here. God advances the gospel despite the worldliness of his servants. Here we discover that the churches of Rome were no less subject to the fallenness of human nature than any other. And having mentioned that Christians in general were speaking the gospel more boldly because of his imprisonment, he's forced to acknowledge, actually, all is not well. Everything isn't rosy in the garden. So he speaks of two categories of people, distinguished very clearly and directly by their attitude towards Paul personally. So taking the positive first, there are some who preach Christ from goodwill, verse 15, out of love, verse 16, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. There are some who have recognized this Paul he is God's servant doing God's work, and we want to be a part of this. We want to join in that work. And they've done that from good hearts and good motives in a good way. And then there are others. There are others who preach Christ from envy and rivalry. Verse 15. Out of selfish ambition. Verse 17. Not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. These are scathing words, aren't they? Somehow these church leaders have taken offense at Paul. We're not told why. The commentators all kind of dig around and try to come up with theories about why this might be, and some come up with great kind of theological ideas. I don't think that's right, actually. Sadly, I think what we're told here suggests something far more petty and pathetic. Paul speaks about envy, rivalry, selfish ambition, utter worldliness. Church leaders are called to be above reproach, called to be an example to the flock, but they're sinners. And that means they're capable of all sorts of things, including false motives for being in ministry. My best guess, if you want to guess, my best guess, and the reason I say this is that it still happens today, is that there were some in Rome who had come to see themselves as spiritual big shots. They got invited to speak at all the conferences, they got all the best book deals, they were on God TV, the whole lot. They were the big shots. They were important, they were doing God's work, and boy, were they good at it. And then suddenly, who does this guy think he is? Suddenly Paul arrives in Rome in chains, and all eyes turn to him. The great apostle. Who does he think he is? We've been slogging away for years doing all the hard work. Well, we'll show him. He can languish in prison while we pack out every venue we can find. And we'll run out of places on our CE courses. And we'll just go on and on from strength to strength, and that'll show him. Envy, rivalry, selfish ambition, thinking to afflict Paul, to rub salt in his wounds. In chapter 2, Paul will commend Timothy. He says, I have no one like him, for they all seek their own interest, not those of Jesus Christ. This is an astonishing thing, isn't it? Fallen nature is a very strange thing. So what we have here is people whose hearts are filled with all manner of selfishness, and yet Paul says repeatedly that they are nonetheless preaching Christ. They're preaching Christ. There's no indication that these people are preaching false doctrine. If they were, Paul would absolutely rail against them. So they're not heretics, they're just hypocrites. There's a disconnect between their hearts and their mouths. All sorts of godliness is coming out of here, while all sorts of ungodliness is roiling around in here. And yet, says Paul, Christ is being proclaimed. Now, I do think we need to tread carefully here. We have to recognize, don't we, that all of our service is flawed. If we know anything of our own hearts, we should be amazed that God ever uses any of us. And the last thing we should do is look at this text and, isn't it terrible, these other people out there who are like this. We should never assume that our motives are always perfect. Nonetheless, it is an amazing thing that God can bring about good, even from Christian service, which is really aimed at hurting Paul, or at building up the preacher's empire, or at whatever else it might be. God will sometimes use even deeply flawed service. He works in mysterious ways, as we sang this morning. And people sometimes come to faith through ministries that have all sorts of problems. I would have all kinds of issues with much Pentecostal ministry, for example, but without a doubt, people are sometimes saved in Pentecostal churches. Over the last few years, we've seen a number of ministry scandals, tragic ministry scandals, particularly in the UK and the US, where it has come to light over time that much admired men who were undoubtedly preaching Christ were concealing very serious sin indeed. And one of the perplexing things about them, at least in some cases, is just how much good was done through men who, it turns out, were profoundly flawed. What do we make of that? Well, it's just God's mercy, isn't it? It's just sheer mercy from a God who doesn't want people to be lost, but wants people to come to a knowledge of the truth. He is far more gracious than we deserve, and he uses flawed service. And so here there's a personal animosity towards Paul, but nonetheless, Christ is being proclaimed, and Paul will take hold of that with both hands. In that I rejoice, he says. You can try to rub salt into my wounds, but I'm just going to rejoice as long as Christ is being proclaimed, because he's everything. Does that mean it's okay to preach Christ from envy and rivalry and selfish ambition? Of course not. Does it mean that we can expect that kind of preaching to be blessed by God in the same way that honest, sincere preaching, we look to God for his blessing? Of course not. Does it mean that if he'd been at liberty, Paul would have joined in common cause with these people? I don't think we can even assume that. Good motives for ministry were hugely important to Paul. He speaks about it often. I could spend the next 10 minutes going through those, but let me just give you one example. When he writes to the Thessalonians, he makes a point of saying to them, you know that my work among you didn't spring from error or impure motives. I wasn't out for gain. I wasn't out for anything for me. Sincere motivation for gospel work matters hugely to Paul. So again, the heading is very deliberate. The other way around from the first one, God doesn't advance the gospel through the worldliness of his servants. That goes against his ways. But amazingly, he advances the gospel despite the worldliness of his servants. He's gracious. And Paul says, well, I'll take gospel advance wherever I see it. And if it means a bit of hostility towards me, then so be it. He just has a laser focus on the advance of the gospel, and he won't be distracted from it. If God is at work, Paul is rejoicing. I think I've mentioned before an article that I read a while ago. Someone was talking about a friend who used to, whenever he was asked the question, how are you, which, as you know, is a question you get asked often, this man developed the habit of giving a particular answer to that question. Whenever someone said to him, how are you, his reply was, God is on his throne. Everything is going his way, and he loves me. That's a great answer, isn't it? God is on his throne, everything is going his way, and he loves me. Paul would have loved that answer. There he is, in Rome, in chains. Paul, how are you doing? Well, says Paul, God is on his throne. I may be in chains, but God's in charge. Everything is going his way. He's not trying to work out how to get me out of here. He put me here. And this is plan A, and he knows what he's doing, and there's a relentlessness to the unfolding of his work. Oh, yes, and he loves me. I know this. Life may be hard, and his ways may be strange, but he loves me. I think in the end there are two keys to Paul's peace in the midst of trial. The first is that he knows that this is just how God works. God works in these strange ways. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That kind of pattern is at the very heart of the gospel, isn't it? Delivered over according to, and murdered by wicked men, and yet according to the foreknowledge and purpose of God. Both of those things together. And so it is in God's service to this day. And so in the ordinary course of things, gospel advance comes hand in hand with weakness and suffering. Paul knows that. And then the second thing that helps Paul enormously is that he really has absorbed one of the hardest lessons that any of us can ever learn, which is this: it's not about you. One of the hardest lessons to learn in life, isn't it? It's not about you. That's how Paul can find joy even in a jail. It's not about me. The gospel is advancing. That's all that matters. Christ is being made known. That's all that matters. He really has died to self. He really does live to Christ. I mentioned earlier Acts 20 where he says, I know that all sorts of horrible stuff awaits me, and yet I'm going to go. And you say, well, why, Paul? Why are you going to go if all of that awaits you? The next words out of his mouth are, I do not account my life of any value or as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course and the ministry that I received from the Lord Jesus to testify to the gospel of the grace of God. How much would we be liberated, you and I, to serve God if we could say these words from an honest heart? I do not account my life of any value. I don't count my life particularly precious to myself, if only I may finish my course. That's what it's all about. That's what I'm here for. That's all that matters. And so if in the wisdom of God, prison advances the gospel, then so be it. He will go on to say, if in the wisdom of God, death advances the gospel, then so be it. As long as the strange relentlessness of the work of God continues, then so be it. God has a relentless purpose. Jesus says in Matthew 24, the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. There's the program. You know it now. We know it. This is what's happening. This is what history is. The gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Relentless. That's what was happening in Rome. That's what was happening in Philippi. That's what's happening in Larbert and in Grangemouth. What he has promised, he will do. And what that means, if I can just kind of try to draw together all that we've seen today, this morning and this evening, from the parables this morning and from Philippians this evening, everything that we've heard about the perplexity of God's ways, everything that we've heard about the paradoxes of the kingdom of God, it looks so unimpressive and yet will conquer. Just try to draw all of that together. What all of this means for us is comfort. What all of this means for us is peace of heart. What all of this means for us is that you and I can go home tonight. This is what I would love to happen. We go home tonight and we put our heads on our pillows and we sleep soundly, knowing that God is on his throne and everything is going his way. And he loves us. Let's pray. God our Father, you have called us to a life of faith. And so often we just long for a life of sight. We just long to see and to know. We long to be God. We want to see what's happening. We want to know when it's happening and why it's happening and where and how, and when all things will work out. We just want to be you. Father, help us, we pray, to lay it all down. Help us, we pray, to acknowledge that you are God and we are only us. And we are your servants. We are commissioned into your service. We have put on the uniform. And so where you station us, we will be. And what you command, we will do. Help us to surrender before you in this way and to know the joy and the freedom that can only be found in that surrender. Help us to know this coming week, through all the ins and outs of life, through all the challenges, we think of the hardest thing that will face us in the coming week. We pray that in the middle of it, right in the middle of it, we would know you are on your throne, everything is going your way, and you love us. Hold us fast with these truths, we pray. Give them to us as an anchor. And keep us looking to you, now and always. For these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.